Great. So welcome to The Forge, an online journal for organizers. I'm Solana Rice. I'm co-founder and co-executive director of Liberation in a Generation. Liberation in a Generation is a movement support organization dedicated to building the power of people of color to totally transform our economy, who controls it, how it works, and most importantly, for whom. We bring together advocates, community organizers, economists, and other proven and emerging leaders of color across the country to build a liberation economy within one generation. Today, I'm delighted to bring to you Alicia Garza, principal of Black Futures Lab, political strategist, organizer, cheeseburger enthusiast, and author of The Purpose of Power: How We Come Together When We Fall Apart. Thank you for taking time with me, Alicia. How are you feeling today?
Well, I'm feeling good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for our conversation.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of, it was a joy to read your book. I could see myself in your story. This book is part memoir, part guide, part historical narrative. You mentioned in the epilogue that it was a difficult book to write. Can you say why?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, book writing in and of itself is it's special. I'm not going to say it's awful because I love writing. And, long form pieces are great ways to really walk out your ideas. But that was what was hard about the book, was walking out my ideas. And when I started writing this book, I thought it was going to be like a book about BLM. And I was going to do all the things that we've been asked 1,005 times, right? All over the world. And when I started writing, when I sat down to write, that's not actually what came. Years now into what has become an incredibly transformative movement, not just for this country, but for this world, the question that has stuck with me over and over again is, are we clear about what we're doing? And I meet people all the time who, because of the way our movements are projected out into the world, they want to know how they can turn the thing that they care about into a movement. And so the way that they ask me that is, how do I turn a hashtag into a movement? And I used to roll my eyes and get really upset about this, right? Because it's like, what do you mean? You cannot turn a hashtag into a movement. But I understand, right, that because of the way that people learn about social movements, we learn about change through fairy tales. And I really wanted to write a book that intervened in those fairy tales. I do believe in magic. I believe in the magic of what happens when people come together, realize their collective power, and use that power in order to get things done. But at the same time, I think the fairy tales get in the way of really understanding how change works. And it scares people off from becoming a part of change efforts. I want everyday people to see themselves as superheroes. And so for me, the process of writing this book was really vulnerable because I wanted to help other people place themselves in history, understand how they have been shaped, how the world has shaped their ideology, how it shaped the way that you be in the world, and also how it shapes how you show up in collective efforts with other people. And I also wanted to make some things plain that I think we don't talk about in social change. We don't talk about the fact that movements are messy. We don't talk about the fact that movements are messy because they are comprised of flawed human beings who are trying to do things that have not been done before. So my hope with this book and my offering is that people can see themselves in it and say, oh my gosh, it's not just me. And also, we got to get through this. We got to do new things so we can unlock new opportunities and start making new mistakes. I hope what this book spurs is more organizers to write. I hope this book spurs more people to think about what their role is inside of social change. And I also hope this book spurs conversations inside of our movement about the things that get in the way of us being as powerful as we must be. We have a mandate to not just run shit, right?
Yeah.
We have a mandate to transform the way that things operate. And that means that we have to approach our movement work as art and as science. And so I'm hoping that this book is a catalyst for that.
Yeah. For those who haven't read the book yet, what do you see as the purpose of power? Why do we have it? Who has it? And I'm also curious, I can name many ways in which we fall apart, but I want to hear from you what you mean when you talk about us, quote, falling apart.
I love this question. So, first and foremost, the purpose of power is to transform our lives and to change the things that we can no longer abide by. And the purpose of movements is to build the kind of power necessary where we can distribute power differently than it is right now. Right now, the way that power is organized is that there's a lot of it concentrated into the hands of a small few. And that has vast and devastating impacts for the most of us. And the purpose of power, right, is to use it in the vein of changing the things in people's lives that frankly are killing us, killing our families, and killing our planet. With that being said, I think so many of us talk about power, right? It's become like a buzzword over the last decade. Power, 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 power. But I've also realized we all have really different definitions of what power means and what it looks like to build it, what it looks like to wield it, and what are the consequences of it. And frankly, in my 20 years of organizing, I think that our movements are scared of power. And so I really wanted to center this book on power and the things that help us build it and the things that get in the way, because I think power should be central to everything that we do. I get why we're scared of power. We're scared of power because the way that it operates right now is deeply corrosive, it's deeply corrupt. And we don't see many of our people, right, getting catapulted into positions of power where we get to make the rules, where we get to shape the rules, where we decide where resources go and where they don't go, where we shape the story of who we are and who we can be together. And also, frankly, where we are the deciders, right, of the consequences that will be levied if people and when people disappoint us, particularly people who represent us. So those things to me are power. And I think Supervisor Holly Mitchell said it best, right? Power is really the process of who gets what when. I wish I had that definition when I wrote this book. It's useful right now. I will say also that for me, I think a lot of our efforts can be geared around empowerment versus power. And that is a detriment to our agenda to change people's lives, real people's lives, not some mythical middle class, right? Not some mythical, deeply hurting white person in a rural area, right? But like literally, right? There are so many of us for whom we think about power as feeling good about ourselves. We think about power as being at the table, but we don't think about power in these ways that really connote our ability to even set the menu when people sit down at the table, right? What are the options that people are considering? That is power. So I really wanted to make sure that as I was writing this book, we're coming back to that over and over again. What does it mean to build power? What is getting in the way of us building power? How do we know if we have it? How do we leverage it? What are the mistakes that have been made in leveraging power? And how do we shift away from that? What are the mistakes that we need to make in order to learn more about how to transform power in the way that it operates? So there's that. The question of, how we come together when we fall apart. The reason I chose that tagline, and it was something we went back and forth about quite a bit, I didn't want it to be one of those self-helpy books because I don't want to pretend like I have all these answers. I don't. All I'm doing is sharing the things that I've learned, the things I've unlearned and am still unlearning, and the things that I'm reflecting on as a part of being in a process of building power. With that being said, I think that we have had conversations over the last 5 years about the deep polarization of this country. We have talked about polarization as if it's new. And we've talked about polarization in ways that I think don't go deep enough, right? We say, oh, well, we can't talk about race because it's deeply polarizing, right? All this conversation about race is tearing us apart as opposed to bringing us together. And I'm like, I don't believe in that. I look at movements and organizing kind of like house cleaning, right? There's a period of chaos before you get the satisfaction of organization. And I think that that's really reflective of what's happening in this country. We go through periods of chaos before there is the opportunity to put things back together again. Now, for a lot of us, the way that things were organized before Donald Trump became president of the United States were not good. And so we have this ongoing tension of, well, what are we putting back together again when the thing was deeply, deeply horrible to begin with? And my position on this, and I talk about this in the book, is that as change agents, we have to figure out where we are starting from and where we're headed. And so many of us, I think, myself included, kind of root ourselves in chaos theory without being able to clearly articulate, well, if we were to put things back together again, what would it look like? And I think there's challenges to that, to being so deeply rooted inside of um, uh, being thrilled by chaos. I mean, here's the deal. I too can appreciate the failures, right, of the state. I can appreciate the failures of capitalism. I can appreciate all of those things. And the reason I can appreciate them is because I know how devastating they are to our communities. But that's not enough. For people who don't have roofs, for people who don't have health care, for people for whom they can't send their kids to school and they don't know what's happening when they do send their kids to school, it's not enough to say, oh, good, the state is failing. Oh, good, capitalism is failing. We have to also be able to say, this is what it needs to look like. And so for me, the how we come together when we fall apart is fundamentally pushing us to articulate what is the thing that we're trying to build? What are we aiming toward? What are we moving toward together? Now, over the last decade, things have become awful. And the fact of the matter is, we are now in a moment that I think is akin to another reconstruction. And people can argue about, is it the second one? Is it the third one? Is it the fourth one? I'm gonna leave that up to y'all, but I'm gonna say we are in a reconstruction moment. And, when we look back at the first reconstruction, or at least what people tend to identify as the first one, what we know is that there was a period of about 12 years, right, when everything was possible, when things had literally fallen apart. The Union won the Civil War, right? The Confederacy was effectively defeated. And the people who were left had to figure out what they were putting back together again and for whom. And it was a time when rights for Black people were expanded dramatically. It was a time when the United States government, maybe for the first time, really deeply invested in understanding what have we been doing to enslaved Black people and what do we need to do to fix it. And then after that 12-year period, there was an intense backlash that literally re-entrenched so many of the rules that many people were trying to unrig. They rigged the rules again, and those rules have had consequences for generations, including, the filibuster, which is something that we're all talking about right now. So for me, if this is a reconstruction moment, what kind of architects are we going to be, and what are we building? That's the main question that I think every organizer should have on their mind right now. And alongside of that, what kind of power do we need to build in order to build the world that we want? Now, I think we face some of the same consequences as we faced in the last period of Reconstruction, which is that we know already that there is going to be an intense backlash. In fact, we saw it, the beginnings of it, right, on January 6th. Some might say that we've been experiencing, white nationalist backlash for years now, and I would agree with that. But we are in a moment of opportunity. And so what are we going to do with it? What are we building? And what can we build that can remain standing even against the force of intense backlash? Those are the questions that I think we need to be grappling with. And it's some of the questions we'll be grappling with in the paperback version of the book.
Great, 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 great. Yeah, I mean, you've said so much about holding that vision, not only about what we need to tear down, but also what we need to build. This idea, I really appreciate the idea of cleaning house, right? And we, Ananya Roy, when we first started this into the pandemic, had a beautiful piece about what we're taking with us, right? And so when I clean my house, I'm like, do I really need this? Does this bring me, does this bring me joy? Right. And I think we have to really look at the things that are holding us back and recognize that some of this stuff we just don't need anymore. We don't need racism. We don't need as much extraction as we're doing. We don't need a lot of the things, but the people in power might disagree. So it does beg the question about how are we challenging power? And I often say the road to some of the visions that we're holding, ending climate change, creating a more sound democracy, equity in our economic prosperity, all the good progressive stuff. I think that all those things run through communities of color. And you spoke to and you wrote about, without Black people, there is no such thing as a progressive anything. And at the same time, we say that you mentioned Black people are under-organized. So how do we, if the road goes through Black and Brown communities, but we haven't charted the highway or the path, what does that mean for change making? And maybe where have you seen some good examples of this lesson coming to life?
Oh, yeah. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I think it lays out the work in front of us. It's absolutely right that there is no progressive anything without Black communities. And that has been true since the founding and the establishment of this nation. But the challenge that we face is that if Black communities are a liberatory piece of a multiracial movement that can transform this country, and Black communities are deeply under-organized, then what do we do to activate and motivate and engage Black communities in a broader movement that serves us all? The challenge that we face is that we're not scientific enough about who our people are and where our people are and what they care about, what they long for, and how they describe themselves. I've had this conversation with many people, including my friend George Gale from People's Action. And the gag is there's very few Black people that identify as progressive. Now, doesn't mean that our values aren't there. It doesn't mean that we don't deeply understand, oh yeah, it's bad, right? When our communities are next to coal factories or our communities are in harm's way due to climate change. We get that because we live there, right? Oh yeah, it's bad when people are being asked for ID to vote, right? We have a long history of understanding what it means to be blocked from making decisions about our own lives on purpose. And at the same time, our movements have been built in such a way where similarly to events throughout history, white communities are seen as the tip of the spear. And then more recently, right, we try to bring Black communities along to what we assume is good for white people, so then it's good for everybody. And I say this in the book that for too long, white communities have been used as the control in the experiment of what it means to transform this country. It is a part of how white supremacy operates. It puts whiteness above everything, and it makes it the thing that we compare everything else to to determine whether it's worthy or valuable or not. But that doesn't work with Black communities. And at the end of the day, it's an organizing challenge for us. I've been in so many multiracial organizations and coalitions. That's the work I've done literally my whole life. And Black people are always like this much of the coalition. And people are like doing extra outreach to the Black people that they know. And they're like, hey, this is going to be good for you. You should show up. I remember when I was first being organized, and I mean, I won't name the group, but, I remember being approached by, people from socialist organizations, and they're not talking to me about healthcare. They're not talking to me about college debt. They're talking to me about Mumia. And I'm like, cool, I know Mumia, but also, right? How are you bringing me into this coalition? And how are you doing it in such a way that is deeply rooted in my experience and deeply rooted in what I long for? And so that is the question for us. How do we organize communities that have been left out of our own movements for social change and for social transformation? And I think it happens in a couple of ways. Number one, we need to stop talking at Black people and talk with Black people. Black folks, and we did this project in my organization, Black folks have a lot of ideas about how this country needs to be transformed. And they're excellent and brilliant. You know why? Because our families for generations have experienced what it means to be left out and left behind. We talk about these things at the dinner table all the time, right? What would it mean, right, if government worked better? What would it mean if our kids actually got an education that was culturally relevant? What would it mean, right? Black people have always had to backfill what has been missing. So we have a lot of ideas about the changes that have to happen. So we've got to do a lot more listening and a lot less talking at. The second thing I think we have to do is really approach our movement work from a race forward perspective as opposed to a race neutral one. And this is a concept that I think the left, with a big L, really struggles with. We have this class over race thing that we've been doing for a very long time, and it has not been successful. Yes, class is in a lot of ways a great equalizer, but how do we understand capitalism without understanding race? How do we understand it without understanding gender? These are all deep operating principles that organize our lives. And so it's better to address it, right? And to lead with it rather than ignore it and act like if we don't talk about it, it will just go away. That doesn't work. And we saw that with the last administration. So let's learn that lesson. And then the third thing I think is really important here, and I talk about this in the book, is I think we have to create spaces and allow for spaces where Black people can get organized without the watchful gaze of other communities. And people have a hard time with this concept because, number one, for some people, it feels exclusive, right? Well, when are we going to come together? And if we can't build a multiracial movement, if Black people are over here doing our own thing. And the thing I say all the time is, listen, if Black folks don't get on the same page and deal with our stuff in our community, we're not going to be a helpful part of this coalition. We have Black faces in high places that throw Black people under the bus all the time. We have deeply racist narratives that we have internalized about ourselves and each other and the communities that we need to be in relationship with. And somebody has to also do that work. And it can't happen if somebody is always in the room talking about, well, I too know what it's like to be oppressed, or I too, it's like, cool. Yeah.
But what about? But what about?
A lot of us have that experience, but there's something about the way this country is organized that has punished Black people for getting together and figuring out what it is that we need. This started inside of chattel slavery, and it still exists today. We have to be able to be courageous enough to break those chains and know that Black folks know that we are not the majority of the population. And so we know we can't just take things over on our own, but we have to come to grips with, what do we have in common with other communities who are marginalized and oppressed? What does it mean to stand in active solidarity and not practice a crabs in a barrel mentality? This is work that Black-led and Black-focused organizations can do, and that we do. And we don't do it and say, oh, well, we're just only going to work with Black people. But if we don't get organized ourselves, again, we can't make the right contributions to the type of vibrant, effervescent movement that we deserve, that is our mandate in this moment.
Yeah. My last couple of questions are about power again. And I think this one is more about the hegemony, right? The beliefs, the norms, the assumptions that undergird and flow throughout all of our policy making, all of our interactions with one another, our movement building. You describe the importance of organizers doing that political education to sort of unearth and expose assumptions and beliefs. Especially with Liberation in a Generation, we focus on racial economic justice. And that is one of the most deeply seated and sort of invisible power of racial capitalism, right? That we all, I did a session once and we all went around the room and I said, let's just say a phrase that we grew up with in your upbringing. And to a person, it was unreal how many of us as people of color said we have to work twice as hard to get half as much. This world isn't fair. All these like pretty devastating lessons that we had to learn early on. And those are all built into the way we operate in the world. I'm wondering, where have you seen good culture work happening? Where is this shift really, really moving our beliefs? Where is it moving our norms and assumptions about deservedness, about anti-Blackness, et cetera?
Mm. Oh, this is such a great question. Well, I think it's happening in a few places, but before I get there, I couldn't agree more that there are these deeply harmful narratives that keep us from moving in the direction that we need to go. And by keeping us from moving, what I mean is, because they are deeply internalized, right? These are the things that we do to stop each other from being more bold, to stop each other from being more innovative, and to limit the possibilities of what's on the table. I think Black Lives Matter has actually changed the conversation culturally, and it has done so under great duress. And I can give a few examples, right? To this day, we get a lot of, and by we, I mean BLM, which, for full transparency, I left the day-to-day operations of in 2017. So in that movement, what often gets talked about and lifted up from our communities as a reason that we can't support Black Lives Matter is that we question the permanence and the utility of a nuclear family. And people say, oh my God, they're against the Black family. And we're like, no, not at all. In fact, we're recognizing that families look different for everyone. And that as a part of racial capitalism, we have had to choose our families or have them chosen for us, right? And so there's that kind of a narrative that I think is deeply harmful. This narrative that the only form of Black family is between a heterosexual and cisgender Black man and Black woman, and that in that relationship, right, everything becomes subservient to the Black man, while we pay a lot of lip service to the queenhood of Black women. And then we leave out everybody in between. And then we wonder why it doesn't make sense that so many Black folks are on the street. Well, there's a lot of Black folks on the street without homes. One, because people are being kicked out of their homes for being queer. Two, because people cannot enter the formal economy because of their gender presentation. Three, because of the ways in which the war on drugs has devastated our communities and devastated our households, right? There are all these different factors that we don't discuss. Another great example that I think is very current and relative to the Biden-Harris administration and their kind of approach to economic resilience and economic justice is kind of this age-old discussion about wealth generation in Black communities and how it has to start with home ownership and small business owners. And I often say, you cannot talk about economic sustainability in Black communities by only focusing on people who own Black businesses, by asking people to attend Black colleges and to encourage Black people to buy homes. That is the most ridiculous assumption that I've ever heard. It makes people feel better because it literally says, oh, well, if we just do what white people are doing, we're going to get ahead. There's not enough money in the world to get Black people to just buy homes and go to Black colleges and start Black businesses that is going to accelerate economic progress in our lifetime in Black communities. It's just not possible. And that's because the rules have been rigged. So if you're not unrigging the rules while you are encouraging Black home ownership with massive investments in capital, if you are not unrigging the rules while you are providing more capital and more access to capital for Black businesses to emerge, then you are just repeating the same story and expecting different results, which we all know is the definition of insanity. I think one more story that is really important that I'll highlight from this summer is the narratives that we have about Black protest and Black activism. And frankly, I had to interrupt an op-ed that was being co-written by a prominent figure from the last period of civil rights and a more recent prominent figure who is an elected official in a particular political camp. And with the uprisings of this summer, they really wanted me to sign on to an op-ed that was committing again to the principles of nonviolence, which I thought was absolutely ridiculous. I said, there's no question that I'm not out here burning buildings. But you know what? Let me just be clear. When I'm watching this news coverage, I'm seeing a lot of white people out here. Why do we feel like we have to continue to say, we don't want to break stuff, we don't want to burn stuff, we're not the ones who are doing that, when if you just open your eyes you can see that that's not happening, right? It's like we are constantly investing in these narratives that make us at once want to prove ourselves and our worth, our dignity, and our piousness to a group of people who will never believe that. So we have to just stop doing it. We only have finite energy, and our energy should be directed in ways that are strategic. And those are not strategic directions for our energy to constantly rename ourselves as nonviolent, knowing good and damn well we're not driving the tanks, we're not throwing the rubber bullets, we're not holding riot shields. That's not us, right? So this is all a part of hegemony. And I talk about hegemony in the book. I do talk about the narratives, the stories, the values, right, that we espouse, that we don't even question why they come out of our mouths, but they shape rules and they shape whether or not we fight and how we fight. So if we're not paying attention to that as organizers, if we're not understanding deeply the root causes of the things that we face, but also our opposition strategy to keep us from fighting back, we cannot be effective fighters.
Yeah. Yeah. The last question is a little bit of a personal one. So, you talk about the profiles and platforms and pedestals that we all have as individuals, and then some folks get put on a pedestal in our movements, right? And you really encourage readers to use our profiles and our platforms to be in service to the movement. And I'm curious about, how do you answer that question for yourself? What is the work that you do? When are the times that you're like, "Ooh, that's not," like your pedestal alarm bells go off? Yeah, and sort of what is the work that we need to do in the progressive movement to embrace and balance celebrity? Because, as you say, we all have positions in this ecosystem of a movement?
Yeah. I love this question and I love this chapter. And it's one of the chapters that I spent the most time on because I felt that it was a message for us in this moment. You know, over the last decade, it is true that um, many of us have gone from, relatively unknown organizers in communities, right? Running and leading and engaging small campaigns that reach smaller groups of people, changing rules in cities, changing rules in states, changing rules in communities. And that transition from being relatively unknown to being catapulted onto a global stage is one that is deeply uncomfortable, not just for the individual, but certainly for movements. And in this chapter, I talk about some of our best strategists and thinkers and leaders and organizers who are constantly told by our movements to be smaller, to not be to not take up so much space. And it seems like a contradiction to me because the way I understand movements is not that they are social clubs that have like very strict rules for entry, but that we are trying to reach as many people as possible. And we are trying to find all of the people who are looking for us. We're looking for each other. How do you know where to find each other if you don't know where to look, right? And like it or not, where most people look, right, are on these mainstream platforms where everybody is engaging, even those of us on the left. And so then the question becomes, is there a way to use that is full of integrity, that holds down our values, but that also says it's acceptable to try and reach millions of people for whom our organizations are never going to touch them if we don't try. And for me, I personally have spent at least the last decade in this constant tension around, why do you have a profile and I don't have a profile? Why do you have a platform and I don't have a platform? Why do you get pedestalized and I don't get pedestalized? I don't know how to answer that question because I did not design the corporate media. What I know is that what bleeds leads. What I know is that people who are considered to speak well get more coverage. There's all these reasons, right? Why certain people get pushed forward and other people get pushed back or pushed to the side. And we know that, right? So I talk about that in the book and I say, yeah, I mean, I can think of a million campaigns that I've been a part of where certain people, myself included, get thrust to the front because we're seen as articulate or because we're seen as non-threatening or because we know how to communicate ideas clearly that are complicated, whatever it is. I think that we can use profiles and platforms strategically. And I argue, however, that pedestals are the least useful in our movement work. And I argue this for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that pedestals are a part of those fairy tales that we learn about social movements through. And the fact of the matter is, every great leader that you have ever known farts, burps, has done bad things in their life, right? Like
Yes.
there's questions always about whether people deserve those pedestals. But also at the end of the day, pedestals serve to show other people that maybe this is somebody that you can look up to, but you can never reach that level. And as an organizer, I don't believe that. I have seen and been a part of many efforts in my lifetime where people have realized their own power and pushed beyond their own boundaries to do things they never imagined were possible. That's our job as organizers, and we need to continue to do that. And I would never tell somebody who I was organizing in public housing or somebody who I was organizing who was houseless, who got an opportunity to be on MSNBC and talk to millions of people, don't do that. Who do you think you are? I would never. And you should never either. With that being said, I really want and I wrote this book to challenge us, because for some of us, because the infrastructure for our movements and how to be a part of them and how to build them is so weak, a lot of how people come into this work is by seeing people on mainstream platforms and aspiring to be on mainstream platforms themselves. But if that is not connected to and anchored in organizing, all you're doing is building a brand, and all you're doing is trying to be an entertainer or a celebrity. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that's not movement building. So, with that being said, we should not mistake profiles or platforms as organizing. And we saw that, right? We've seen that in kind of mayoral races, right? I talked about this in the book. DeRay McKesson has a huge platform. It's like almost 2 million people, right? He ran for mayor of Baltimore, and I think he secured 4,000 votes. You have a platform of almost 2 million people, and you secure 4,000 votes in a race that only required 45,000 votes to win. That should show us, right, that nothing replaces organizing. Now, at the same time, there are roles for people who are celebrities, entertainers. There are roles for brands. And I think sometimes our approach to organizing is still very much stuck in the 1960s, right? Before the digital era. No shade to that work. I believe in the person to person sitting at the kitchen table. I don't think anything can replace that. And we are in an increasingly digital world, especially under the influence of COVID. So we've got to start to learn how to update ourselves for the 21st century, so that we can not only meet people where they are, but that we can find people where they are talking, where they are looking for information, where they're looking for us. These are the things that keep me up at night. I imagine that people are looking for us on Twitter and can't find us because we're like, I don't do Twitter. What are you talking about? You don't have to do Twitter for like your personal, lifestyle, but like put your organization out there and put your work out there, because people are looking for you, especially in this moment. So for me, I wrote this chapter not to provide all the answers again, but to get us thinking about and being honest about some of the big questions in front of us. Where are we kind of acting an ass and cutting off our nose to spite our face? Where do we have real and valid concerns about what it means to cross over, right? What's the strategy that we want to employ around amplifying ourselves, knowing that in our organizations, the way that we organize doesn't lend itself towards scale in a lot of ways. And by scale, I don't mean in the hundreds. I don't even mean in the thousands. I'm talking about in the millions, right? Our work, as we've constructed it in so many ways, doesn't lend towards that level of scale. That's okay. It doesn't mean that work is not valuable. It means, what else are you complementing it with so that you are reaching the most amount of people with the ideas, with the values, with the practices that we need to transform this country.
Well, Alicia, thank you. I have 3 rapid fire
Let's
questions.
do it.
Favorite color?
Green.
What 2021 is going to be about?
Growing and glowing.
Best cheeseburger?
Ooh. My own. I make the best cheeseburgers out there. I've flipped burgers for many years, and so I know the anatomy and the art of a cheeseburger. But if I am like having to have a go-to, there's a little spot in San Francisco. I hope it's still there. I haven't been anywhere since the pandemic. But there's a little spot in San Francisco that makes an excellent cheeseburger. It's in the Haight. The only critique I have of their cheeseburger is that they use sweet pickles instead of dill pickles, and I think that is a travesty.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. That's really unfortunate. So close. Well, thank you so much. It was great having this conversation. I hope everyone goes out and picks up The Purpose of Power, How We Come Together When We Fall Apart. Thanks for sharing your journey and your work and your lessons, and we look forward to more.
I can't wait. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your work. I'll be following you, Solana. Working on, and I appreciate you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks. Have a good one. Bye.